there is still a lot of fear of going back to what happened last year. The community here was the most impacted health-wise and economically, and people are terrified of reopening too fast.
Joining me now is, well, I'll let SNL introduce him for me.
It's your boy, Fauci, the patron saint of Purell.
Actually, with me now is the real Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. Fauci, thank you very much for coming back to the Sunday Show.
Good to be with you, Jonathan. Thank you for having me.
We'll talk about SNL in a moment. Let's talk about the real urgent stuff here, and that is the news, the surprise announcement this week from the CDC when it comes to masks, not having to wear masks anymore. What would you say to those people we just saw NBC's Ron Allen talking to in the street, expressing skepticism or some caution about all of this? What do you say to those who are skeptical?
Well, it's perfectly understandable. What the CDC change in guidelines means that if you're vaccinated, the science now tells us that you can feel safe, that you are really very well protected. It isn't a mandate for everybody who's vaccinated to take your mask off. It's telling you that from a scientific standpoint, a bit ago it was uncertain just how well protected you were, whether if you did get a breakthrough infection that you might transmit it to others, or with the variants out there, do you really have to worry about them? The science that's now accrued over the last several weeks tells us that all of those things are really quite comforting, that the real world protectiveness and effectiveness of the vaccine is extraordinary, Jonathan, better than what we saw in the clinical trials. It works very well against the variants. And the data now show that even if you get a breakthrough infection and you're without symptoms, the likelihood of you transmitting it to somebody else, which is one of the reasons why we told people who are vaccinated to continue to wear masks, the chances of that is extraordinarily low. So under those circumstances, you can feel safe in not wearing a mask if you're vaccinated, not only outdoors, but also indoors. But there are going to be people who feel they want to just take that extra special diminution of risk, who are more risk adverse. And that could be people who maybe are elderly, who have underlying conditions. So it's for people who feel they want to make that step towards normality, but it's not a mandate that everybody has to rip their mask off.
So then, given what the CDC has done, how likely do you think, how likely is it that states with their mask mandates and companies with their mask mandates, that they will follow suit? How quickly do you think they will follow suit? Or do you think that they will keep them in place for what you were just talking about?
I think the latter, Jonathan. I think many of them might keep them in place because, remember, the change in guidelines refers only to those people who are vaccinated.
Right.
And in the real world, in the workplace or wherever, there are still a lot of people who are not vaccinated. So owners of establishments, airlines, or other organizations and institutions may feel, given the fact that there's still a lot of virus circulating, that you have to consider the safety of people who've not been vaccinated. And for that reason, I do believe what you're suggesting might actually be the case, that there may be organizations who feel they don't want to remove the mask mandate. And I think that's actually a perfectly reasonable conclusion to come to if you're one of those.
And speaking of the unvaccinated, how worried should we be about the unvaccinated? I'm double vaxxed. My mom's double vaxxed. My husband's double vaxxed. About a third of the country is fully vaccinated. But how worried should we be about those who aren't?
Well, I'm very concerned because they're not protected. And that's the reason, Jonathan, why we keep coming out saying, please get vaccinated, not only for your own health, the health of your family, but also the health of the community. Certainly, we don't want anybody to get infected. And if you're asking me, do I worry about people who are unvaccinated? I do. I'm a physician and I'm a public health official. And I do worry about people getting infected. And the best way to prevent yourself from getting infected is to get vaccinated. And that's why we hope that people see that and go ahead and get vaccinated.
Dr. Fauci, let me get your reaction to a statement from the largest nurses union in the country slammed the CDC decision. You see here, the newest CDC guidance is not based on science, does not protect public health, and threatens the lives of patients, nurses, and other frontline workers across the country. This is from the executive director of the National Nurses United.
Well, I would have to respectfully, I have a great deal of respect for that organization. My wife is a nurse. So clearly, I do have a great deal of respect for them. However, I don't think that that's the case, Jonathan. I think that people who are unvaccinated should continue to wear masks. Mm-hmm. We're talking only about the people who are vaccinated, not the unvaccinated. So the unvaccinated people should continue to wear masks to protect themselves. And
this is more reaction I want to get your reaction to. This is element one for the control room. This is the Pennsylvania governor, Tom Wolf, Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, who found the new CDC guidance confusing. Have a listen to what he had to say.
It is confusing. We were taken by surprise by the CDC announcement. And as of today, we're still looking at it. And so what we initially said, which is we get to 70% herd immunity, then we'll lift the mask mandate.
And Dr. Fauci, when it comes to herd immunity, how important is reaching 70% herd immunity?
Well, we don't know, Jonathan, what the exact threshold for herd immunity is. You can make an estimate that it will be somewhere between 70 and 85%. But we're on a track to get to 70% of people with at least one dose, adults that is, between at least one dose by July 4th. And if we do, what we are going to see, and I'll guarantee you that, is a marked diminution in the number of daily cases. We've already come down by at least 1/3 over the last couple of weeks. And as we get to the president's goal of 70% by July 4th, I think you're going to see a marked diminution in that number of cases per day.
Dr. Fauci, there was this story in Market Watch with a question that I would love to have you answer, and that is this. Do breakthrough COVID-19 infections seen in the Yankees and Bill Maher mean vaccinated people should still wear masks? What say you?
Well, it relates to one of the 3 points that I made about what new science has occurred over the last few weeks. You note that I think 7 out of 8 of the people in the Yankees organizations who were infected actually had no symptoms at all. And the science now tells us that if you do get breakthrough infections, like was the case in the Yankee organization, it is extremely unlikely, A, that you're going to get symptoms, and B, that you're going to transmit it to someone else. So that really underscores the validity of that statement that when people are vaccinated, even with breakthrough infections, little risk to their health, and very unlikely they're going to spread it to someone else.
Mm-hmm. There are lots of folks out there who are not just vaccine hesitant, they're vaccine hell no. What do you say to them to convince them that they really should get the vaccine?
Well, Jonathan, you want to reach out to them. You don't want to be accusatory to them or point a finger at them at all, because they may have reasons which in their mind, understandably, are valid reasons why they're hesitant. So you try and find out why they're hesitant and address each and every one of the features of their concern. For example, some people think that this was done too quickly. So there must be something wrong here, because how did you go from just learning about the virus in January to having vaccines going into people's arms in December of the same year? And the answer to that is that the success and the speed was really reflective of decades-long investment in basic and clinical research. So it wasn't something that just started in January of 2020. We were working on the development of various vaccine platforms and immunogen design for a very long period of time. So it isn't that it was rushed. And I think people, when they appreciate that, some of their reluctance and their hesitancy pulls back a bit, because they say, oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, now what's the next reason why you're concerned? And I think if we address them in a understandable way and in a way that is not pejorative or accusatory towards them, I believe that will win people over.
Dr. Fauci, so when I woke up this morning preparing for this interview, of course I see this Saturday Night Live cold open is all about you and the mask mandate. And just on a human level, just how do you feel being portrayed in this way, in a very heroic way, as Kate McKinnon there, you see her, patron saint of Purell. How does it feel to become iconic at this point?
Well, Jonathan, I don't focus on that. I focus on my job and the really serious mandate that I have to do whatever I can to protect the health and the safety of the American public. Those kinds of things sort of interesting, to have Kate McKinnon play you and do that. But that's not really what I'm about. I'm about being a scientist, a physician, and a public health figure. So although it's kind of interesting to see it, I think she's an incredibly talented actress. It's kind of fun, but I don't pay much attention to it, to be honest with you.
Okay, so Kate McKinnon has played you. Brad Pitt has played you, and that came after someone asked you, so who would you like to play you? And you said Brad Pitt. So and I know how serious you are about your job, but who would you love to see play you next?
I don't know. I'm an Italian American, so it would have to probably be Al Pacino or Robert De Niro.
All right, you got that. Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, do you hear that? Dr. Anthony Fauci, as always, thank you so much for your service to the country, but for coming on the Sunday Show.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.